Did you know that Harry Potter, the wizard who defeated Voldemort and became a symbol of goodness and courage in the magical world, used not once, not twice, but 3 times the terrible, unforgivable curses? Those same curses that are considered heinous crimes in the wizarding world, capable of sending any wizard straight to Azkaban just for using them a single time. The boy who lived, the one we grew up following on his journey against the forces of darkness, crossed a line that few heroes would dare to cross. And the most disturbing thing about all of this is that he didn't use these curses in moments of blind desperation or magical possession. No, Harry was fully conscious, in control of his actions, and still chose to conjure these forbidden spells. But what would lead the boy who lived in the cupboard under the stairs to become someone capable of using the same curses that Voldemort and his Death Eaters used? The answer is much more complex and dark than you imagine, and reveals a side of Harry Potter that many prefer to ignore. Prepare yourself, because today we're going to dive deep into the darkest pages of the saga, exploring every moment when our hero gave in to darkness and used the unforgivable curses. But before we begin this disturbing journey through Harry Potter's mind, I need to make a special request to you who are watching now. If you're a true fan of this magical saga and want to be part of this growing community, click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any video. Each subscription helps us enormously to continue producing this type of detailed quality content. And tell me here in the comments, from which city are you watching this video? I love knowing where the Potterheads are. Now yes, let's get to what matters, because the story you're about to discover will completely change the way you see Harry Potter. To understand the gravity of what Harry did, we first need to comprehend exactly what the unforgivable curses are and why they receive such a fearsome name. In the wizarding world, there are 3 spells that are considered so sinister, so profoundly evil, that their use against another human being results in life imprisonment in Azkaban without the right to trial or appeal. These 3 curses are the Imperius, which completely removes a person's free will and turns them into a puppet in the caster's hands. The second is the Cruciatus, a torture curse that causes pain so intense and unbearable that it can drive its victims to permanent insanity, as happened with Frank and Alice Longbottom, Neville's parents. And finally, we have the most terrible of all, the Avada Kedavra, the killing curse, which instantly kills its victim without leaving any physical mark, only the absolute void of death. These 3 curses were classified as unforgivable in 1717, and since then, any wizard or witch who uses them is committing a crime against magical humanity. What makes these curses truly special and horrifying is not just the devastating effect they cause, but rather the intention necessary to conjure them. Unlike other spells that can be executed with a simple combination of wand movement and correct words, the unforgivable curses require something much deeper and more disturbing from the caster. They need a genuine will, a real desire to cause that specific evil. As the false Professor Moody, who was actually Barty Crouch Jr., in disguise explained to Harry's class during 4th year at Hogwarts, you could point your wand at him and say, Avada Kedavra, but you probably couldn't even cause a nosebleed because you lack the true intention, the power, the genuine desire for death. To conjure the Cruciatus, you really need to want to cause pain, to feel pleasure in torture. To use the Imperius, you need to have an iron will of domination and control over another being. And to cast the Avada Kedavra, you need to deeply and sincerely desire another person's death. This means that Harry Potter, when using these curses, wasn't just pronouncing magical words. He was channeling the darkest emotions of the human soul, allowing the darkness within him to manifest in a concrete and destructive way. Let's now go to the first moment when Harry Potter crossed this line and used an unforgivable curse. It was the year 1996, during Harry's 5th year at Hogwarts, one of the most turbulent and emotionally devastating periods of his life. Dolores Umbridge had transformed the school into an authoritarian regime. The Ministry of Magic denied Voldemort's return, and Harry was isolated, furious, and misunderstood. He had constant visions of Voldemort's mind through the connection they shared, and these visions tormented him day and night. It was in this context of extreme pressure that Harry had the most terrible vision of all. He saw Sirius Black, his godfather and the only true father figure he had known, being tortured by Voldemort in the Department of Mysteries. Desperate and terrified, Harry organized a completely reckless rescue mission, taking with him some members of Dumbledore's army to the Ministry of Magic. What Harry didn't know was that this was all part of an elaborate trap by Voldemort to lure him there and make him retrieve the complete prophecy about the two of them. The battle in the Department of Mysteries was chaotic, intense, and terrifying. Harry and his friends, just teenagers, faced experienced and cruel Death Eaters in a labyrinthine environment full of mysteries and dangers. During the fight, the young people were separated, injured, and were clearly at a disadvantage. It was then that the moment that would change Harry forever happened. Bellatrix Lestrange, Sirius's cousin and one of Voldemort's most fanatical and sadistic followers, hit Sirius with a spell while he was fighting bravely. Sirius fell backward through the mysterious veil that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead and disappeared completely. In that instant, Harry saw the only family he had brutally and definitively torn from him. Pain, anger, absolute despair took over every fiber of Harry's being. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, simply acted driven by a fury he had never experienced before. Harry ran after Bellatrix, who was fleeing, laughing at her own cruelty, mocking Sirius's death as if it were just another entertainment in her life dedicated to evil. Harry pursued her through the corridors of the Ministry, his mind consumed by a single thought: revenge. When he finally reached her in the main atrium of the Ministry, he raised his wand and screamed the words he never imagined he would say, the words he had learned during the false Professor Moody's classes: Crucio. The Cruciatus curse, the torture curse, came from his wand and hit Bellatrix. However, the effect was not complete. Bellatrix fell to the ground, felt pain, but not the unbearable and devastating pain that the curse should cause when properly conjured. She quickly recovered and mocked Harry, saying that it was necessary to really want to cause pain, that it was necessary to enjoy the torture, to feel pleasure in it, and that righteous anger was not enough to execute the curse effectively. Those words were a cruel lesson about the nature of the unforgivable curses. But even though the curse wasn't fully effective, the fact remains unchangeable. Harry Potter had tried to torture someone, had conjured an unforgivable curse with the intention of causing pain, even if his technical execution was imperfect due to his lack of true malice. In that moment, a part of Harry's innocence died along with Sirius. After this first use of an unforgivable curse, Harry had to deal not only with the pain of losing Sirius, but also with the disturbing knowledge that he was capable of using dark magic when sufficiently provoked. The feeling of guilt haunted him throughout the following summer, while he was trapped at Privet Drive, mulling over that moment over and over in his mind. Dumbledore, who knew of what happened through testimonies and perhaps through his own forms of surveillance, never punished Harry for it, never reported him to the Ministry, never even mentioned the subject directly. This raises profound questions about the morality of the wizarding world and about how extreme circumstances can change the rules that normally govern society. Harry had crossed a line, but the world around him decided to forgive this transgression, understanding that the war against Voldemort would not be won by strictly following the rules established in times of peace. Harry Potter's next use of an unforgivable curse happened almost 2 years later, during the chaotic and desperate events of 1998, when the Second Wizarding War was at its peak and the forces of darkness seemed to be winning on all fronts. Harry, Ron and Hermione were on their desperate mission to find and destroy Voldemort's Horcruxes, living as fugitives, constantly in danger, witnessing unimaginable atrocities as the wizarding world crumbled around them. It was during the invasion of Gringotts Bank, one of the most audacious and dangerous missions the trio had ever undertaken, that Harry used the Unforgivable Curses again, but this time in a different way, and on multiple occasions. The objective was to steal Helga Hufflepuff's cup, one of the Horcruxes, from Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, located in the most secure and well-protected depths of the Goblin Bank. To have any chance of success in this practically impossible mission, Hermione used Polyjuice Potion to transform into Bellatrix, while Harry and Ron disguised themselves as other wizards. They also had the reluctant help of Griphook, a goblin, who agreed to assist them in exchange for the sword of Godric Gryffindor, although his true intentions were doubtful from the beginning. When they arrived at the bank, everything started to go wrong quickly. The goblins began to suspect the strange behavior of Hermione disguised as Bellatrix, questioning her identity and demanding proof they couldn't provide. The bank employees were about to discover the farce and sound the alarm, which would mean certain capture or death for the trio. It was in this moment of extreme danger that Harry made a decision that 2 years earlier would have been unthinkable for him. He conjured the Imperius curse on one of the bank employees, assuming total control over that wizard or goblin's mind and actions, turning him into a puppet to facilitate their invasion. But Harry didn't stop there. As they descended into the bank's depths toward Bellatrix's vault, they encountered more obstacles and more people who could denounce them. Harry, now having crossed the line for the second time, didn't hesitate to use the Imperius again, and then once more, controlling multiple Gringotts employees to ensure they reached their destination. Each time he conjured the curse, it worked perfectly, showing that Harry had developed both the technical ability and the will necessary to execute this forbidden magic effectively. There was no longer the hesitation of the 15-year-old boy who had tried to use the Cruciatus against Bellatrix. Now, Harry was a 17-year-old wizard, hardened by war, by loss, by constant despair, and he had internalized a brutal truth. To defeat Voldemort and save the magical world, he would have to use all available tools, even those considered unforgivable by the society he was trying to save. The Gringotts mission was a success, but it had a significant moral cost, not only for the use of the unforgivable curses, but also for Griphook's betrayal and the destruction caused in the bank. The multiple use of the Imperius during the Gringotts invasion reveals a disturbing evolution in Harry Potter's character. He was no longer reacting on emotional impulse as he had done when trying to use the Cruciatus against Bellatrix. This time, Harry used the unforgivable curses strategically, calculatedly, premeditatedly. He knew before entering the bank that he would probably have to use these curses, and still decided to proceed with the plan. This demonstrates that Harry had reached a pragmatic understanding of war. Sometimes morality has to be sacrificed in the name of the greater good. It's a philosophy that Dumbledore would understand very well, given his own dark past and his own morally ambiguous decisions. Harry was transforming into a war leader, and war leaders frequently have to make choices that will weigh on their consciences for the rest of their lives. Each time he conjured the Imperius, he was telling himself that the end justified the means, that saving the magical world from Voldemort was worth the price of his own soul. But Harry Potter's journey through the dark side of magic still hadn't ended. There would be one more moment, one last and definitive act of forbidden magic that would cement Harry forever as someone who was willing to go to the darkest places of the human soul to protect those he loved. This moment happened during the Battle of Hogwarts, the final confrontation between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, when everything was at stake and there was no more room for hesitation or doubt. Hogwarts was under attack. The protective shields had fallen. Death Eaters were invading the corridors of the school that Harry considered his true home, and people were dying every minute. Harry was desperately searching for the last Horcrux, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, knowing that without destroying it, Voldemort would remain immortal and invincible. During this frantic search through the warring corridors of Hogwarts, Harry witnessed a scene that awakened in him a visceral rage and a thirst for revenge that he hadn't felt since Sirius's death. Imperius Carrow, one of the most despicable and cruel Death Eaters who had spent the entire year torturing students as a Hogwarts professor under the Voldemort-controlled regime, spat in Professor McGonagall's face. Minerva McGonagall, the woman who had been a mother figure to Harry since his first day at Hogwarts, the professor who had always defended students ferociously, the deputy headmistress who represented everything good and noble that Hogwarts could be, was being disrespected and humiliated in the vilest possible way by a man who had spent months torturing innocent children. Harry was present in that room, hidden under his invisibility cloak, and upon seeing that spit, something inside him simply exploded. The anger he felt was not the explosive and uncontrolled fury he had experienced after Sirius's death. It was something colder, more controlled, more frightening in its deliberation. Harry removed his invisibility cloak, revealing himself completely, and without a second's hesitation, without any warning, without any prior threat, he pointed his wand directly at Amicus Carrow and shouted, "Cruciatus!" This time, unlike the frustrated attempt against Bellatrix years before, the curse worked perfectly. Amicus was hit by the Cruciatus curse at its full strength and was thrown into the air, writhing in absolute agony, experiencing pain so intense that it is beyond the capacity of any normal person to understand. He fell to the ground, unconscious, due to the unbearable pain that Harry deliberately inflicted upon him. Professor McGonagall, despite appreciating Harry's protection and the fate that Amicus deserved, was visibly shocked. She had seen much in her long years as a professor and witch, had fought in wars before, but seeing Harry Potter, the boy she had known since he was 11 years old, use an unforgivable curse with such effectiveness and deliberation, clearly disturbed her deeply. But she didn't reprimand him, didn't punish him, didn't report the crime to the authorities. Because, in that moment, in the middle of a war, with Voldemort and his followers trying to destroy everything they loved, the normal rules of civilized society had been suspended. What makes the use of the Cruciatus against Amicus Carrow particularly significant and concerning is that it demonstrates that Harry had finally developed the ability to execute this curse perfectly. Bellatrix had said that it was necessary to really want to cause pain, to feel pleasure in torture, and now, years later, Harry clearly had this capacity within him. He had changed, hardened, matured in ways that few heroes of children's stories ever do. Harry Potter was no longer the innocent boy who discovered he was a wizard on his 11th birthday. He was a veteran war soldier, someone who had seen too much, lost too much, suffered too much. The successful use of the Cruciatus against Amicus represents the darkest point of Harry's journey, the moment when he completely embraced the darkness necessary to win that terrible war. He had become, in certain aspects, exactly the type of wizard he was fighting against, someone willing to use the unforgivable curses without hesitation when he deemed it appropriate. After analyzing all three moments when Harry Potter used the unforgivable curses, we need to ask the most important question of all. What does this mean for Harry's legacy and character? How should we judge a hero who uses the same weapons as his enemies? The answer is not simple, and that's exactly why the Harry Potter story is so rich and complex. J.K., Rowling could easily have written Harry as a perfect hero who never deviates from the correct moral path, who always finds a solution that doesn't compromise his principles. But she chose not to do that. She chose to show that even the noblest heroes, when placed under extreme pressure, when forced to choose between their principles and the people they love, can and will make morally questionable choices. Harry is not perfect, and that's exactly what makes him such a fascinating and human character. It's important to contextualize Harry's uses of the unforgivable curses within the war scenario in which he was living. During the Second Wizarding War, the magical world was literally fighting for survival. Voldemort and his Death Eaters had no moral scruples, no line they wouldn't cross, no atrocity they considered excessive. They tortured, killed, enslaved, and did all of this with sadistic pleasure. Fighting against this type of extreme evil, using only defensive spells and stunners, would be like trying to put out a forest fire with a glass of water. Harry understood, even if unconsciously, that to defeat Voldemort, he would have to be willing to go to dark places, use methods that would normally be considered unacceptable. This doesn't make his actions right or wrong in absolute terms, but places them in a moral grey zone that is much more interesting and realistic than a simplistic narrative of good versus evil. It's also worth noting that Harry never used Avada Kedavra, the killing curse, despite having had multiple opportunities to do so. During his final duel with Voldemort, when everything was at stake and he had every reason in the world to simply kill the Dark Lord, Harry chose to use Expelliarmus, a disarming spell, the same simple magic he had used countless times throughout his life. This deliberate choice not to kill, even when killing would be the easiest and possibly wisest solution, shows that Harry maintained a fundamental line that he wasn't willing to cross. He used the Cruciatus to torture, used the Imperius to control, but he didn't use Avada Kedavra to kill. Taking a life directly, in a premeditated and personal way, was a line that Harry Potter refused to cross, no matter how desperate the situation. This preserves something essential of his humanity and his character, even amid all his other morally questionable acts. The question of punishment, or lack thereof, is also fascinating. Harry Potter was never arrested or tried for using the unforgivable curses. He never faced legal consequences for crimes that, according to Wizarding World law, should result in life imprisonment in Azkaban. Why? The answer lies in how societies treat their war heroes. Throughout real human history, soldiers who commit acts during wars that would be considered crimes in peacetime often receive pardon or immunity, especially if they fought for the winning side. Harry was essential to Voldemort's defeat. He saved the magical world from tyranny and destruction. In this context, Wizarding society collectively chose to ignore his transgressions, to consider them necessary given the extraordinary circumstances of war. This raises profound questions about justice, morality, and how our laws and principles bend and break under extreme pressure. Another important aspect to consider is the psychological impact that using these curses had on Harry. We know that he carried guilt for the attempt to use the Cruciatus against Bellatrix, spending the entire summer after Sirius's death tormented not only by the loss, but also by what he had tried to do. As for the later uses of the Unforgivables, especially the successful torture of Amicus Carrow, we don't have direct access to Harry's thoughts after the war. But it would be impossible for these acts not to have left psychological scars. Using torture magic, even against someone who deserves punishment, changes a person. Controlling the minds of other human beings, completely removing their autonomy and free will, leaves marks on the caster's soul. Harry probably carried these memories and these guilts for the rest of his life, occasionally waking up in the middle of the night remembering Amicus Carrow's screams as he writhed under his Cruciatus, or wondering about the Gringotts employees he controlled like puppets and who weren't guilty of anything. The Unforgivable Curses also serve as a brilliant narrative device that J.K. Rowling uses to explore deep themes about power, corruption, and the nature of goodness. The great question that the saga always poses is, what makes us different from our enemies? If we use the same methods, the same curses, the same cruel tactics, are we still the good guys? Harry Potter answers this question in a complex and mature way. Yes, he used the unforgivable curses. Yes, he lowered himself to his enemy's level at certain specific moments. But he never lost sight of his greater objective, never began to feel pleasure in cruelty, never abandoned his fundamental compassion. He did terrible things, but did them for reasons that, if not totally justifiable, are at least understandable within the extreme context in which he was operating. This is much more interesting and real than a perfect hero who never makes mistakes or never faces genuine moral dilemmas. Comparing Harry with other characters in the saga also gives us interesting perspective. Dumbledore, Harry's great mentor, also made morally questionable choices throughout his life, from his youth when he associated with Grindelwald to his elaborate manipulations of Harry during all the years at Hogwarts. Snape, another complex character, regularly used dark magic, including the Unforgivables, both during his time as a Death Eater and later as a double agent. Even characters generally seen as totally good, like Molly Weasley, killed during the final battle. Harry Potter's world is not divided into perfectly good people and perfectly bad people. It's a spectrum of grey, where almost everyone makes questionable choices when sufficiently provoked or when the need is great enough. Harry is simply somewhere on that spectrum, closer to light than darkness, but certainly not immaculate. Harry's relationship with these curses also changes over time and circumstances. His first attempt against Bellatrix was purely emotional, impulsive, driven by unbearable pain and blind rage. He couldn't even execute it properly because, in that moment, he still didn't have the capacity to really want to torture someone with the necessary intensity. His multiple uses of the Imperius at Gringotts were tactical, calculated, necessary for a specific mission he considered vital to defeating Voldemort. There was no pleasure there, just cold pragmatism. And finally, his torture of Amicus Carrow was a combination of instinctive protection of someone he loved and respected, McGonagall, mixed with justified anger against someone who had spent months torturing innocent students. Each use has its own nuance, its own context, its own partial justification, and this makes the analysis much richer than simply saying that Harry used unforgivable curses and therefore is bad. Another fascinating element is how Harry himself justified these actions to himself, both in the moment and subsequently. When he used the Imperius at Gringotts, he was on a mission to destroy a Horcrux, part of a larger plan to defeat Voldemort and save countless lives. It's easy to justify almost any action when you can argue that you're saving the world. When he tortured Amicus, he was defending McGonagall and punishing someone who had committed atrocities against children. Again, a justification that, while it doesn't make the action right, makes it at least understandable. But these justifications are exactly the type of rationalization that people who do bad things use to sleep at night. The line between a hero making difficult choices and a villain rationalizing his bad actions can be dangerously thin, and Harry Potter danced on that line several times throughout the saga. One aspect that cannot be ignored is how Harry's example affects other characters and wizarding society itself. If the Chosen One, the hero who defeated Voldemort, used the unforgivable curses and was forgiven for it, what message does this send to other wizards and witches? Does it establish a dangerous precedent where these curses can be used if circumstances are considered sufficiently extreme? Does it create a situation where war heroes have different rules from ordinary people? These are uncomfortable questions that wizarding society probably preferred not to face in the post-war period. It's much easier to place Harry on a pedestal as the savior of the magical world than to critically examine the morally ambiguous choices he made to achieve that salvation. But this type of collective moral amnesia has its own dangerous consequences, creating a society where rules are applied unequally depending on who you are and what you've done. We should also consider how knowledge of these curses and the ability to use them permanently changed Harry as a person. Once you know you're capable of torturing someone, that you have within you the darkness necessary to cause unbearable pain to another human being, you can never see yourself the same way. Harry carried this knowledge into his adult life, into his career as an auror, into his role as a father. He knew there were lines he was willing to cross, that there was a version of himself capable of terrible acts when sufficiently provoked or when those he loved were in danger. This type of self-knowledge can be both a strength and a burden, a source of power and simultaneously a source of shame and fear of oneself. Harry's complete trajectory with the Unforgivable Curses also perfectly reflects his general journey in the saga, from innocent child to warrior hardened by battle. In the first book, Harry was an 11-year-old boy marveling at the existence of magic, discovering a new and fantastic world. By the end of the saga, he was a 17-year-old young man who had seen death, destruction, betrayal, and unimaginable horror. He had lost his mother and father before even having memories of them, lost Sirius, lost Dumbledore, lost Hedwig, lost Dobby, lost Fred Weasley, lost Lupin and Tonks, lost so many people he loved that he eventually became numb to death. This evolution from innocence to bitter experience is perfectly reflected in his growing willingness to use forbidden spells. The Harry of the first book could never imagine that one day he would use the Cruciatus. The Harry of the last book not only used it, but used it with lethal effectiveness. There's also an interesting technical question about how Harry learned to execute these curses so effectively. He had only one class about them during fourth year, when Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Moody, demonstrated them. There was no formal training, no practice on dummies or in controlled environments, nothing that prepared Harry technically to conjure these spells. However, when the time came, he succeeded. This suggests that the Unforgivable Curses are less about technique and much more about emotional state and willpower. Any wizard with sufficient magical power and the correct emotional disposition can execute them. Years of study or extensive practice are not necessary. It's only necessary to truly want the curse's result, whether control, pain, or death. This makes them even more frightening because it means they're potentially within reach of anyone who loses emotional control or who develops the necessary darkness within themselves. Harry's first failed attempt to use the Cruciatus against Bellatrix is particularly revealing when contrasted with his successful use against Amicus. Between these two moments, approximately 2 years passed, but Harry changed in ways that go far beyond simple maturation. He had become colder, more willing to do what was necessary, more comfortable with his own capacity for violence. Sirius's death broke something inside him, but it was the subsequent deaths and the continuous horrors of war that rebuilt Harry into something different, something more dangerous. The boy who cried over Cedric Diggory's death in fourth year was dead. In his place was a young man who could torture without hesitation when he deemed it appropriate. It's also interesting to think about how Harry's friends reacted to his use of the Unforgivable Curses. Ron and Hermione were present during the Gringotts invasion and witnessed Harry using the Imperius repeatedly. Neither of them protested, neither of them suggested an alternative, neither of them questioned the morality of what Harry was doing. Why? Because they too had changed. Hermione, the girl who in third year was horrified when Harry received the firebolt without knowing its origin, was now willing to accept the use of Unforgivable Curses as a pragmatic necessity. Ron, who was always more emotional and impulsive, probably would have used the curses himself if he were in Harry's position. The trio grew up together, and part of that growth was the gradual loss of their illusions about absolute morality in times of war. Professor McGonagall, one of the most morally upright figures in the entire saga, personally witnessed Harry torturing Amicus Carrow. Her reaction was complex and revealing. She was clearly shocked, showing that even she, a veteran of multiple wars, didn't expect to see Harry cross that line. But she didn't punish him, didn't stop him, didn't report the incident. Instead, she quickly moved on, focusing on the larger crisis unfolding around them. This choice by McGonagall to essentially ignore a serious crime committed right in front of her says a lot about how even the most principled people can make concessions in extreme situations. She understood that punishing Harry in that moment, in the middle of a battle for Hogwarts survival and the magical worlds, would be absurd and counterproductive. But this pragmatic understanding doesn't erase the fact that she witnessed and allowed a crime that, in any other circumstance, would have resulted in immediate arrest. Returning to the central question that permeates this entire discussion, we must ask whether Harry Potter can still be considered a true hero after using the unforgivable curses. The answer depends fundamentally on how we define heroism. If heroism means absolute moral perfection, never deviating from the correct path, never compromising principles regardless of circumstances, then no, Harry is not a true hero. But this definition of heroism is childish and unrealistic. True heroism, the kind that exists in the real world and not just in simplified fairy tales, involves making impossible choices in impossible situations. It involves carrying the weight of morally ambiguous decisions. It involves dirtying your hands to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It involves living with guilt and regret while continuing to fight for what you believe is right. By this more mature and realistic definition of heroism, Harry Potter is absolutely a hero, perhaps even more so because he's not perfect. What makes the story of Harry and the Unforgivable Curses so powerful is that it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ourselves. It's easy to say we would never use such curses, that we would never compromise our principles, that we would always find a better alternative. But how would we really react if we saw someone we love being murdered in front of us? How would we react if the only way to protect our friends was to use methods we consider morally reprehensible? How would we react if the fate of the world literally depended on our actions, and morally pure options simply weren't available? It's very comfortable to judge Harry from our armchairs, but the uncomfortable truth is that many of us would probably make similar choices, or even worse, in the same circumstances. Wizarding society after the war had to deal with profoundly complex questions about justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Many wizards and witches had used the unforgivable curses during the war, both on Voldemort's side and on the Resistance's side. How to judge all these cases, how to distinguish between justifiable use and criminal use, how to prosecute thousands of people for war crimes when the governmental structure itself was rebuilding. The answer, historically, both in the real world and in the wizarding world, tends to be a mixture of selective justice, pragmatic amnesties, and convenient amnesia. Some were punished, especially those who lost the war, or those whose crimes were so extreme they couldn't be ignored. But many others, including Harry, simply moved on with their lives, carrying their actions as poorly kept secrets that everyone knows but no one mentions. Harry Potter eventually became an Auror, a wizard responsible for capturing dark criminals, and later ascended to head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This means that he, someone who used unforgivable curses without facing consequences, was now in the position of arresting and judging others for doing exactly the same. The hypocrisy of this situation didn't go unnoticed by more critical observers of wizarding society. How could Harry justify arresting someone for using the Imperius when he himself had used it multiple times? The pragmatic answer is that context matters, that war circumstances were exceptional, that Harry had justifiable reasons while common criminals don't. But this is a thin and dangerous line to draw, effectively creating two classes of citizens with different standards of moral and legal responsibility. Harry's own children, Albus Severus, James Sirius, and Lily Luna, grew up with a father who was a national hero, but who also carried dark secrets about his past. Harry probably never told them in detail about his use of the unforgivable curses. Like any father, he wanted his children to see him positively, as an example to be followed. But eventually, through history books, through stories told by others, through research in old newspapers, his children would discover the truth. And when they discovered it, how would they deal with the knowledge that their father, the man who taught them about right and wrong, had used spells considered unforgivable by society? This is a question Harry probably feared facing, but which would inevitably arise. It's also important to consider how public knowledge about Harry's use of the unforgivable curses affected his reputation over the years. In the first years after the war, when he was universally celebrated as the savior of the magical world, such details were conveniently ignored or forgotten. But as years passed and new generations emerged that hadn't lived under Voldemort's terror, more critical voices probably emerged questioning Harry's actions during the war. Revisionist historians could argue that he was no different from the Death Eaters who used the same curses. Wizarding civil rights groups could use Harry as an example of why the unforgivable curses should remain unforgivable without exceptions, even in wartime. This critical reassessment of war heroes is a common phenomenon in post-conflict societies, and Harry wouldn't be immune to it. The connection between Harry and Voldemort, established when Voldemort tried to kill him as a baby, adds another layer of complexity to this discussion. Harry carried a piece of Voldemort's soul within him, a living and unconscious Horcrux. This connection gave him access to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions, and vice versa. Is it possible that part of Harry's ability and willingness to use the unforgivable curses came from this connection with the darkest wizard who ever existed? Did the presence of Voldemort's fragmented soul within him make Harry inherently more capable of accessing the darkness necessary for these curses? This is a question without a definitive answer, but raises unsettling possibilities about how much of Harry's behavior was truly his, and how much was influenced by Voldemort's presence within him. Even after the destruction of this Horcrux during the Battle of Hogwarts, Harry would have been permanently changed by years of exposure to Voldemort's mind and feelings. Comparing Harry with other characters who use the unforgivable curses reveals an interesting spectrum of motivations and contexts. The Death Eaters used them out of sadism, for pleasure in cruelty, out of devotion to an ideology of pure blood supremacy. Barty Crouch Sr. authorized the use of the unforgivable curses by Aurors during the First Wizarding War, a desperate decision that showed how far even government officials were willing to go. Several members of the Order of the Phoenix probably used these curses at some point during their long struggles against the forces of darkness. Harry fits somewhere on this spectrum, closer to the desperate defenders than to the sadistic aggressors, but still a user of forbidden magic. One of the most disturbing and revealing scenes related to the unforgivable curses that many forget is the fourth-year class where they were demonstrated. Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, showed the 3 curses to a room full of 14-year-old students. He cast the Imperius on a spider, making it dance and behave in unnatural ways. He cast the Cruciatus on another spider, making it writhe in silent agony. And finally, He killed a third spider with Avada Kedavra right before the horrified eyes of the students. This experience traumatized many of the students, but also served as brutal education about the horrors they would face in the real world. Harry, in particular, absorbed these lessons differently from the others because he already knew that his destiny was intertwined with Voldemort's, that he would inevitably face these curses and those who used them. The fact that Harry eventually used these same curses that horrified him when he first saw them demonstrates how much experience and necessity can change a person. The 14-year-old boy who watched that class was disturbed and frightened. The 17-year-old young man fighting for the magical world's survival used these curses without hesitation when he deemed it necessary. This transformation is both understandable and tragic. Understandable because it makes sense that repeated traumatic experiences and extreme pressure would change anyone. Tragic because it represents the loss of innocence, the death of the version of Harry who still believed there was always a solution that didn't require compromising his principles. Another crucial point that deserves attention is the difference between the three unforgivable curses in terms of moral gravity. Although all are classified equally under wizarding law as unforgivable, there are arguments to say they're not morally equivalent. Avada Kedavra kills instantly and painlessly, ending a life completely. Cruciatus causes extreme pain and can lead to insanity, but doesn't necessarily kill. Imperius removes free will temporarily, but doesn't cause direct physical harm. Harry used the last two, but not the first, suggesting that he himself made distinctions between them in his own moral hierarchy. He was willing to control and cause pain, but not to kill directly using magic. This line, he maintained, is significant and says something important about the limits he established for himself, even in his darkest moments. Regret is another important theme to consider. Did Harry regret using these curses? We have no direct textual evidence of deep regret, especially for the uses of the Imperius at Gringotts or the torture of Amicus Caro. This suggests that Harry, in the moment and possibly for the rest of his life, justified these actions as necessary. He probably saw them as sacrifices he had to make, dark parts of himself he had to embrace to achieve a greater good. This type of rationalization is common in war veterans, in people who did terrible things for reasons they believed were good. It's not always complete regret, but rather a heavy acceptance that those actions were necessary given the context, even if they're actions you never imagined doing in normal circumstances. As we approach the conclusion of this deep analysis, it's important to reflect on what J.K. Rowling's willingness to show her hero using unforgivable curses says about the saga as a whole. She could easily have written the story so that Harry never crossed this line, that he always found alternatives, that he remained morally pure from beginning to end. But she chose not to do that, and this choice makes Harry Potter a much richer and more mature literary work. By showing that even the chosen one, the hero destined to save the world, can and will make morally questionable choices when under sufficient pressure, Rowling was making a sophisticated comment about human nature and about the reality of war and conflict. The message is not that using unforgivable curses is acceptable or correct. The message is that all of us, even the best of us, have capacity for darkness when circumstances push us to our limits. The message is that heroism is not about moral perfection, but about continuing to fight for what's right, even when you had to do wrong things along the way. The message is that war changes people, that trauma and loss leave permanent scars, that sometimes there are no good choices, only less bad ones. These are complex and mature lessons for a series that began as children's literature, but it's exactly why Harry Potter transcended its initial genre and became a culturally significant work for readers of all ages. Looking at the complete saga through the lens of Harry's use of the unforgivable curses, we see a much darker and morally complex story than many remember. Harry Potter is not just a story about a magical boy defeating an evil villain. It's a story about how violence begets violence, about how fighting monsters can transform you into a monster in certain aspects, about how trauma and loss shape who we become, about how the lines between hero and villain can be surprisingly thin when you look closely. Harry's use of the unforgivable curses doesn't diminish his heroism, but complicates it in ways that make him more human, more real, more relevant to our own lives and moral choices. In the years since the end of the Second Wizarding War, Harry had to live with his choices, with the memories of what he did, with the knowledge that there's a version of him capable of torture and mind control. He built a family, had a successful career, became a respected figure in wizarding society. But on dark nights, when he's alone with his thoughts, it's impossible that he doesn't occasionally return to those moments. The expression on Amicus Carrow's face as he writhed under his Cruciatus, the empty eyes of the Gringotts employees as he controlled their minds, the cruel pleasure on Bellatrix's face as she mocked his failed attempt to torture her. These memories don't disappear, aren't erased by victory or time. They're permanent parts of who Harry Potter became. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The choices we make, especially the difficult and morally ambiguous choices we make in moments of extreme crisis, define us in permanent ways. We can't undo them. We can't go back and choose differently. All we can do is carry the weight of those choices, learn from them, and try to use those lessons to make better choices in the future. Harry Potter used the unforgivable curses 3 times throughout his life. He can't change that fact. But what he can do is ensure that the world he fought for, the world he helped save using questionable methods, is a world where future generations don't have to make the same terrible choices he made. So, when we look at the initial question, all the times Harry Potter used an unforgivable curse, we find 3 specific moments that reveal deep layers of moral complexity, character transformation, and the brutal reality of war. A failed attempt to torture Bellatrix Lestrange, driven by pain and rage after Sirius's death. Multiple successful uses of the Imperius during the Gringotts invasion, executed calculatedly and strategically as part of a vital mission, and a successful torture of Amicus Carrow using the Cruciatus in defense of Professor McGonagall and as punishment for months of atrocities against students. 3 moments that together tell the story of how an innocent boy transformed into a warrior, willing to embrace darkness when necessary to protect those he loves and fight for what he believes is right. The Harry Potter saga is ultimately a story about choices. Dumbledore famously said that it's our choices, far more than our abilities, that show who we truly are. Harry chose to use the unforgivable curses at critical moments of his life. These choices showed that he was someone willing to sacrifice his own moral purity for the greater good, someone who would carry the weight of guilt and moral complexity so others wouldn't have to. Someone who understood that sometimes there are no perfect solutions, only the best you can do in impossible circumstances. This doesn't make him a saint, but it also doesn't make him a villain. It makes him human, flawed, real, and perhaps, paradoxically, it's exactly this that makes him a true hero. And with that, we reach the end of this deep journey through Harry Potter's darkest moments. If this video made you think differently about the boy who lived, if it gave you a new perspective on morality, heroism, and the impossible choices that war forces us to make, then every second of your attention was worth it. Don't forget to leave your like, share with other Potterheads who appreciate deep analysis, and of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're building a community of fans who go beyond the surface, who want to truly understand the complexities of this magical saga we all love. And tell me in the comments, do you believe Harry was justified in using the unforgivable curses? Or did he cross a line that should never have been crossed? The debate is open. Until the next video, and remember, not everything in the magical world is black and white. Sometimes there are shades of grey that are much more interesting to explore.